The cabin stood as a bastion against the world, a fortress of solitude built from hewn logs and silence. Inside, former Marine Master Sergeant Jack Callahan waged a quiet war against memory. Each morning began with the snap of discipline, a ritual as ingrained as cleaning his rifle. The floorboards were cold against his bare feet, a precise shock that grounded him in the present. Coffee, black and bitter, was brewed with military precision. The bed was made with corners so sharp they could have cut glass. This order was his armor, the only defense he had left against the chaos that grief had carved into his soul. 42 years old, he had the build of a man still capable of carrying the world on his shoulders, but his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held a vast and frozen emptiness. He had come to this remote corner of the Colorado mountains to escape ghosts. The ghost of his wife, Sarah, whose laughter once filled every space, now echoed only in the oppressive quiet. Her favorite quilt remained folded at the foot of the bed, a soft, colorful rebuke to his stark existence. He never touched it. The ghost of Aries, his military working dog, was a heavier presence still. A noble German shepherd, Aries had been more than a partner. He had been a part of Jack's own heart, a silent confidant through 2 tours of unrelenting sand and fire. Aries had died in his arms, a victim of the same blast that had shattered Jack's knee and ended his career. The empty space by the hearth where the dog's bed used to lie was a wound that would not heal. His sister, Chloe, had called the week before, her voice a bright, unwelcome intrusion into his gray world. She worried. She pushed. "Just go into town, Jack. Get some decent food. The storm they're predicting sounds serious." He had grunted a non-committal reply, but her words, like seeds in frozen ground, had taken root. The discipline that governed his life demanded preparedness. A blizzard was an enemy to be respected, its logistics to be managed. So he had made a list, a tactical outline for a simple supply run: propane, non-perishables, batteries. A mission. Missions he understood, feelings he did not. Driving the old pickup truck down the winding mountain road was a controlled descent into a world he preferred to keep at a distance. The town of Aspen Creek was nestled in the valley, a postcard of rustic charm that felt alien to him. People smiled, they greeted each other. It was a language he no longer spoke. His final stop, after the hardware store and the grocer, was an afterthought, a place he had actively avoided for 2 years, the county animal shelter. He only went because he needed a durable chew rope to fix a tie-down on his generator cover, and he knew they sold surplus pet supplies for cheap. The air inside the shelter was thick with the scent of disinfectant and a low, desperate hum of animal anxiety. It scraped at his nerves. He kept his eyes down, focused on the mission. Find the supplies, get out. But as he paid the young woman at the counter, a sound cut through the noise. Not a bark, but a low, mournful sigh from the last kennel in the long, concrete corridor. It was a sound of profound resignation, a sound he knew from the battlefield, from men who had seen too much. It was a sound he recognized from his own mirror. Against his better judgment, he found his feet moving toward the sound. In the last kennel, a large German shepherd lay on a thin blanket, his head on his paws. The dog's coat was the color of sable and smoke, his frame powerful but weary. He was the very image of Ares, a ghost made flesh. But it was the dog's eyes that seized Jack's heart in a cold grip. They were clouded, a pale milky blue, staring into a darkness that had nothing to do with the dim light of the kennel. They were blind. A small laminated card was clipped to the wire door. It read, "Shadow, male, 5 years, former K9, special needs." Below, in smaller letters, were the words that sealed the animal's fate: "Experienced handler required, not suitable for families." It was a death sentence, written in polite, bureaucratic prose. The young woman from the counter, whose name tag read Elena, appeared at his side. Her voice was gentle. "He's a good boy, just had a rough go of it." Jack didn't reply, his gaze locked on the dog. Shadow lifted his head, his ears swiveling to pinpoint Jack's location with unnerving accuracy. He did not bark or growl. He simply watched, or seemed to, with those sightless eyes that saw more than most. "He was a police dog," Elena continued. sensing the question in Jack's silence. Caught some shrapnel from a car bomb during a bust. It saved his handler's life, but it took his sight and his nerve. They retired him. He's been here for 6 months. Nobody wants a broken hero. Broken. The word echoed in the barren chambers of Jack's own chest. He knew what it was to be broken. He knew what it was to be retired from the only life you ever knew, to be left with scars both seen and unseen. He saw his own reflection in this dog, the discipline, the training, the nobility, all masked by a wound that had rendered him useless to the world. A storm of emotion, the very thing he had spent 2 years suppressing, churned within him. It was a bitter, familiar tempest of rage and sorrow. He looked at Shadow, who had laid his head back down with another sigh, and for the first time in years, Jack felt the ice around his heart begin to crack. The mission had suddenly changed. "I'll take him," Jack said. The words came out rough, rusted from disuse. Elena stared at him, her kind eyes wide with surprise. "Mr. Callahan, are you sure? The paperwork is extensive, and he requires a lot of specialized care. He's difficult. He doesn't trust anyone." Jack's gaze didn't waver from the dog. "I've handled difficult before," he said, the statement hanging in the air with the weight of unspoken history. The first fat snowflakes had begun to drift past the shelter's small window, a silent warning of the coming storm. There was no more time for debate. This was no longer a choice. It was a deployment. He was rescuing one of his own. The paperwork was a fortress of its own, each question a barrier designed to deter him. Did he have a fenced yard? Experience with working breeds? A veterinarian reference? He answered with clipped, precise responses. He was a former K-9 handler. His commanding officer would provide a reference. The yard was the entire damn mountain. He signed the forms with a steady hand, the signature a stark, angular declaration of intent. Elena watched him, a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, in her expression. She gathered a worn leash, a bag of food, and a folder of medical records. "His name is Shadow," she said again, softly, as if reintroducing them. He responds to a low, calm voice. Leading the blind dog out of the shelter was like navigating a minefield. Shadow moved with a tense, cautious gait, his powerful body rigid with uncertainty. The unfamiliar sounds and smells of the world outside his concrete box were an assault. When they reached the truck, the dog balked, planting his feet, his head low. Jack didn't pull or force him. He knelt, the cold of the snow-dusted asphalt seeping through his jeans. He let the dog smell his hand, a hand that knew the language of these animals, a language of quiet strength and patience. He murmured to him, the words low and steady, the same tone he had used with Ares in the thrumming belly of a helicopter. "Easy, boy. You're with me now. It's all right. We're going home." Slowly, tentatively, the dog leaned forward and licked his hand, a gesture of trust so fragile it felt like a prayer. Jack guided him into the passenger seat, the dog trembling but compliant. The drive back up the mountain was a slow, arduous crawl. The snow was falling faster now, a thick white curtain that reduced visibility to near zero. The world dissolved into a swirl of gray and white. Jack drove with intense focus, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the dog, a silent promise of security. Shadow sat stiffly, his ears constantly twitching, mapping this new, terrifying world through sound and vibration. The truck, the winding road, the howl of the rising wind, it was an ordeal, a trial by ice and fear. For both of them, reaching the cabin felt like reaching a fire base after a long patrol. They were safe, for now. The real battle was about to begin. Inside, the cabin's warmth was a stark contrast to the blizzard now raging outside. The wind shrieked around the eaves like a hungry predator. For Shadow, the transition from the cold, vibrating truck to the silent, warm interior was another shock. He stood frozen on the small rug by the door, his body a coiled spring of anxiety. Jack watched him, his own discipline kicking in. This was a tactical problem. The objective: establish a safe zone. He moved slowly, deliberately, letting his footsteps and the soft rustle of his clothing be a guide for the blind animal. He filled a heavy ceramic bowl with water and placed it on the floor. then tapped it twice. Water, Shadow. He did the same with a bowl of food. The dog didn't move. He remained a statue of fear, lost in a world he could not see. Jack understood. The dog's armor was his caution, his stillness. To move was to risk collision, to risk the unknown. Jack's own armor had been the same: emotional stillness, a refusal to engage with the world that had hurt him. He pulled the old, worn bed that had once belonged to Ares from a storage closet. The faint, lingering scent of his former partner clung to it, a ghost of a ghost. He placed it near the stone hearth in the warmest part of the room. "Here, boy," he said softly. "This is your place." For hours they existed in this stalemate. Jack sat in his worn armchair, watching the fire and the dog. Shadow stood by the door, his breath misting in the cool air, a sentinel guarding the border between his past and this uncertain future. Jack didn't push. He knew this kind of war. It was a war of attrition, won not by force, but by patience. He started to talk, his voice filling the silence that had been his only companion for so long. He told the dog about the cabin, about the way the snow piled up on the western side. He told him about Ares, about their missions, about the impossible bond between a man and his dog in a place where death was a constant shadow. He spoke of Sarah, his voice cracking on her name, telling the blind dog about the color of her eyes and the way she'd hum when she gardened. He was confessing to a blind priest, pouring out the grief he had locked away for 2 years. He spoke until his throat was raw, and as he spoke, something shifted in the room. The tension in Shadow's powerful shoulders began to ease. Guided by the sound of Jack's voice and the warmth of the fire, the dog took one hesitant step, then another. He moved like a shadow, flowing across the floor, his paws making no sound. He navigated around the coffee table with an eerie precision, his nose testing the air. He stopped a few feet from Jack's chair. Jack held his breath. Slowly the dog moved forward until his head was resting gently on Jack's knee. The knee that had been shattered, the knee that ached with the cold and the memory of loss. The contact was electric. The simple, trusting weight of the dog's head was an anchor in the storm, both outside and in. Jack tentatively reached out and stroked the dog's broad head, his fingers sinking into the thick fur. Shadow leaned into the touch, a deep sigh shuddering through his body. It was not a sigh of resignation this time, but of release. In that moment, the sterile fortress of Jack's cabin became something else. The chaos of life, with its muddy paws and its vulnerable, trusting heart, had breached the walls. And for the first time, Jack did not feel the need to reinforce them. He felt a thaw, a slow, painful, but undeniable melting of the internal winter that had held him captive. The blizzard howled for 2 days, cutting them off from the world completely. It was a forced isolation, but it felt different now. It was not empty. Jack and Shadow fell into a new rhythm. Jack learned to signal his movements with a soft whistle or a quiet word. He created pathways through the cabin, ensuring the dog could move with confidence from his bed to his food, to the door, to Jack's side. Shadow in turn began to learn the geography of his new home. Through sound and scent, he was a creature of incredible intelligence and resilience. His blindness was not a weakness, but a different way of seeing the world. He would map the room with his ears, his head cocked, listening to the creak of a floorboard, the hiss of the fire. There were clumsy moments that bordered on humor, a feeling so foreign to Jack it was almost startling. One morning Shadow, trying to locate a dropped piece of kibble, pushed it with his nose clear across the kitchen floor in a determined, shuffling pursuit, his rear end wiggling with concentration. Jack felt an unfamiliar twitch at the corner of his mouth. It was the ghost of a smile. Later the dog, overjoyed by a scratch behind the ears, rolled onto his back with such abandon that he knocked over a small stack of firewood with a loud clatter, then froze, looking utterly betrayed by the floor. Jack let out a short, rough bark of a laugh, the sound so alien in the quiet cabin that Shadow's ears shot up in surprise. It was the first time he had laughed since before Sarah's accident. The sound was rusty, but it was real. On the third morning, the wind died down and a fragile, watery sunlight filtered through the snow-caked windows. The world was buried in a deep, pristine white. The silence was absolute. His satellite phone, which he kept for emergencies, chirped to life. He expected it to be Chloe checking in, but the number was unfamiliar, an official-looking exchange from the state capitol. The voice on the other end was clipped and impersonal. "Mr. Jack Callahan, this is Officer Marks from the state K-9 administration." Jack's gut tightened. "I'm here. It's regarding the German Shepherd, call sign Shadow, that you took from the Aspen Creek shelter," Mark said, his tone devoid of warmth. "There's been a procedural error. That animal was supposed to be transferred to a specialized state facility for evaluation. The shelter didn't have the authority to release him to a private citizen." The calm Jack had cultivated over the past 2 days evaporated, replaced by a cold, familiar fury. He was on a kill list. The shelter called it unadoptable. "That's as may be," Marks replied, unmoved. "Policy is policy. A former handler has also expressed interest in reclaiming the dog, and his claim takes precedence. We'll need to send an officer to retrieve the animal as soon as the roads are clear. Probably tomorrow afternoon. Retrieve the animal." The bureaucratic phrase was a slap in the face. This wasn't an animal. This was Shadow. This was the dog who had laid his head on his knee and trusted him. This was the dog who had made him laugh. The institutional threat, faceless and indifferent, was trying to tear down the small sanctuary he had just begun to build. He felt the old combat instincts surge. Defend your position. Protect your unit. "No," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "Excuse me." Mark sounded annoyed. "I said no," Jack repeated, his grip on the phone tightening. "He's not a piece of equipment to be requisitioned. He's my dog. This is his home." He had said the words. He had declared his emotional investment, not just to the bureaucrat on the phone, but to himself. He was no longer just a caretaker. He was a guardian. "Mr. Callahan," the officer said, his voice hardening, "I suggest you cooperate. We can involve the sheriff's department. Don't make this difficult." The line went dead. Jack stood in the middle of his quiet cabin, the silence now ringing with the declaration of a new war. Shadow, sensing the tension in the air, walked over and nudged his hand with his wet nose. A silent question. Jack looked down at the blind dog, at the unwavering trust in that sightless face. He would not fail him. He would not let them take him away. The threat of separation hung over the cabin, like the heavy, snow-laden branches of the pines outside. Jack felt a restless energy, the kind that came before a mission, a mix of focused anger and hypervigilance. He spent the day reinforcing his defenses, not of the cabin, but of his claim to Shadow. He called his old CO, a man who was now a high-ranking official in the Department of Defense, and left a message explaining the situation. He called Elena at the shelter, who was horrified to hear what was happening and promised to make calls of her own. But these were shots in the dark. The real threat was the ticking clock. Tomorrow afternoon. That evening, a profound disquiet settled over the cabin. Jack found himself watching Shadow constantly, memorizing the way his ears twitched at the sound of a log settling in the fire, the way he sighed in his sleep. The thought of this dog being taken away, sent back to a concrete kennel, or to a handler who had already abandoned him once, was a physical pain. It was the pain of impending loss, a feeling he had tried to wall himself away from forever. Now it was back, and it was sharper than ever because, this time, he had a choice. He could fight. As dusk settled, painting the snow outside in shades of lavender and gray, a sudden sharp crack echoed through the forest. It was the sound of a heavy, snow-laden branch giving way. But to Shadow, it was an explosion. It was the sound of the past roaring back to life. The dog scrambled to his feet. A panicked whine caught in his throat. He was disoriented, terrified, his training and his trauma colliding in a burst of pure fear. Before Jack could react, Shadow bolted. He scrambled toward the front door, the very door Jack had just opened to bring in another load of firewood. In a flash of sable fur, he was gone, disappearing into the twilight and the deep snow. "Shadow!" Jack's voice was a raw cry against the immense silence of the forest. There was no response. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his military calm. A blind dog in a forest buried under 4 feet of snow. with ravines and frozen creeks hidden beneath the surface. It was a death sentence. He grabbed his high-powered flashlight, a heavy coat, and the old leather leash. He didn't pause to think. He plunged into the snow, following the chaotic tracks that led away from the cabin. This was his second ordeal, a rescue far more desperate and personal than the first. The cold was brutal, a physical entity that stole his breath and burned his lungs. The beam of his flashlight cut a frantic path through the darkness, illuminating a world of white and black, of snow-laden trees that stood like silent, indifferent sentinels. He called Shadow's name until his voice was hoarse, the sound swallowed by the vast, frozen wilderness. His old knee injury, the one he shared in a way with the dog, began to throb, then scream in protest against the cold and the exertion of wading through the deep drifts. He pushed the pain down, compartmentalizing it the way he had been trained to do. He switched from panic to procedure. He was a tracker. He forced himself to slow down, to read the signs. The dog was running scared, not with purpose. The tracks veered erratically. Jack followed, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He thought of Ares, of the dust and the heat, and the final, terrible moment. The fear of failing again, of losing another dog he loved, was a fuel that drove him onward, past the point of exhaustion. He found him near the edge of a steep ravine, a dark slash in the white landscape. Shadow was huddled at the base of a large pine, shivering violently, his coat matted with snow. He was whimpering, a low, terrified sound. When he heard Jack approach, he let out a defensive growl, a sound born of fear, not aggression. "Easy, boy," Jack said, his voice gentle despite the raggedness of his breathing. "It's me. It's Jack. You're safe." He knelt in the snow, the pain in his knee white-hot, and held out his hand. He didn't move closer. He waited. Slowly, recognition dawned. Shadow's growl subsided, replaced by an eager whine. He crawled forward, burying his cold nose in Jack's palm. Jack clipped the leash to his collar, the familiar click, a small sound of victory in the vast wilderness. "Okay, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with relief. "Let's go home." The journey back was a brutal, slow-motion battle. Shadow was exhausted and weak, his paws raw from the frozen crust of the snow. At times he stumbled and fell, unable to go on. Jack, his own strength failing, half carried, half dragged the heavy dog, his arms and back straining, his knee a searing point of agony. Every step was a testament to his commitment, a physical manifestation of the vow he had made. He would not leave him behind. He would not fail him. When they finally stumbled back through the cabin door, they were both on the verge of collapse. They fell to the floor in front of the hearth, a heap of exhausted man and shivering dog. Jack built the fire back up until it roared, the warmth a blessing against their frozen bodies. He wrapped Shadow in the old quilt from the end of his bed, Sarah's quilt, tucking it around the dog as he towel-dried his fur. He checked his paws, cleaning them gently. He didn't stop until the dog's shivering had subsided, replaced by the deep, even breathing of sleep. Only then did Jack allow himself to feel the full extent of his own exhaustion and pain. He slumped against the hearth, the dog's warm body pressed against his, and for the second time in his life, he wept for a fallen soldier he had managed to bring home. The next morning, the world was reborn in blinding sunlight. The snow sparkled as if strewn with diamonds. The beauty of it felt like a grace note after the terror of the night. Around noon, the sound of a vehicle grinding its way up the plowed driveway broke the peace. A state-owned SUV, official and imposing, parked beside Jack's truck. A man in a crisp uniform, Officer Marks, stepped out. Jack met him on the porch. Shadow stood beside him, leaning slightly against his leg. "Callahan," Marks said, his expression firm. "I'm here for the dog." Jack didn't move. He simply stood there, a silent mountain of a man, and looked the officer in the eye. "You're too late," Jack said, his voice quiet but absolute. "He died last night." Marks's professional mask slipped, a flicker of shock in his eyes. He glanced at the magnificent dog standing calmly at Jack's side. Jack continued, his gaze unwavering. "The dog you came for, the scared, abandoned K-9 unit designated as Shadow, he's gone. He ran into the blizzard last night. I spent 4 hours out there tracking him down and brought him home. This, he said, placing a hand on the dog's head, is my dog. His name is Buddy, and he's not going anywhere. He told Marks the story of the night before, not with drama or pleading, but with the flat, factual tone of an after-action report. He described the cold, the fear, the ravine. He didn't have to embellish. The raw scratches on his face, the profound limp he couldn't hide, and the unwavering devotion of the dog at his side were evidence enough. At that moment, Elena's car pulled in behind the officers. She got out, her face a mixture of worry and determination. She had a file in her hands. "Officer Marks," she said, her voice strong. "I have the complete intake report on this dog. 6 months of neglect. Not a single inquiry from his former handler until the moment he was adopted. I also have a signed affidavit from Mr. Callahan's former commanding officer. You can take this dog, but we will fight you every step of the way." Marks looked from Jack's resolute face to Elena's fierce expression, then down at the blind dog who was now nudging his master's hand, seeking reassurance. He saw the quilt, an obviously cherished heirloom, draped over the porch railing to dry. He saw the bond between the man and the dog, a thing forged not in policy, but in fire and ice. He was a man of rules, but he was not a man without a heart. He sighed, a long, slow exhalation of defeat. "The paperwork on this transfer," he said, looking out at the mountains, "seems to have gotten lost in the storm. It's a real shame." He looked back at Jack. "You have a good day, Mr. Callahan. Take care of your dog, Buddy." He turned, got back in his SUV, and drove away. The crisis had passed. The war was won. In the quiet aftermath, a new world took shape. The cabin, once a fortress of solitude, slowly transformed. It became a home, filled with the sounds of life. The soft thump of a dog's tail against the floor, the click of his nails on the wood, the low murmur of Jack's voice as he spoke to his companion. Jack started volunteering at the shelter, using his decades of experience to work with the most difficult cases, the dogs everyone else had given up on. He had a gift for it, a quiet patience that seemed to soothe the most traumatized animals. He and Elena formed a friendship, a partnership built on a shared mission. She would come up to the cabin with medical supplies and often stay for coffee. Her warm presence, a gentle light in the corners of his life. One evening in late spring, as the last of the snow melted and the scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, Jack sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of orange and pink. Buddy, now confident and serene, lay at his feet, his head resting on Jack's boot. Jack picked up the framed photo of Sarah that had sat, untouched, on his mantelpiece for 2 years. He looked at her smiling face, and the familiar, sharp pain of her absence was still there. But it was different now. It was a clean ache, not a festering wound. It was a grief that could coexist with peace. He found he could remember her laugh without it breaking him. He told Buddy about her, about the way she would have loved a goofy, noble dog like him. He was no longer a wounded warrior hiding from the world. He was a rescuer who had been rescued, a man who had been given a new mission, not by a commanding officer, but by a blind dog who had taught him how to see again. He had found his way home.